The vast, unyielding canvas of the Pacific theater demanded aircraft of unprecedented range and endurance. One of the cornerstones of Allied air power was the consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber. The B-24 was a crucial, high-production workhorse of the war, though often overshadowed by the more famous Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Its distinctive twin-tail and high-aspect wing gave it a silhouette recognized across every front. However, the B-24, despite its strengths, was always a compromise between bomber and patrol duties. The United States Navy, which needed a long-range maritime patrol bomber, found the B-24 wanting in several critical aspects. The Navy's primary concern was the B-24's high wing loading, which made low-altitude flight over water a tricky and potentially dangerous proposition. Furthermore, the delicate tricycle landing gear was less than ideal for the sometimes primitive landing strips available on remote Pacific islands. The Navy was already utilizing a land-based version known as the PB4Y-1, but they knew a more specialized design was required. This desire for a dedicated, long-range maritime slayer is what ultimately led to the development of a distinct and specialized variant. This new aircraft needed to be rugged, heavily armed, and capable of operating solo for extended periods far from base. It had to embody the resilience and adaptability required for the unique challenges of the Pacific Air War. The Navy decided to commission a significant overhaul of the original B-24 design. This was not merely a modification. It was a fundamental re-engineering of the aircraft's core structure and capabilities. They sought an airplane that could survive the rigors of anti-submarine patrols and anti-shipping strikes. The new design would retain the Liberator's proven wings and powerful Pratt and Whitney engines. It would, however, undergo a transformation that would change its very profile, distinguishing it forever from its bomber ancestry. This required a complete rethink of the tail assembly, which became the most visible change of all. The twin-rudder design of the Liberator was deemed insufficiently stable and robust for low-altitude maritime work. The result of this naval requirement would be an aircraft that looked like a close relative, but one that possessed a profoundly different mission and fighting spirit. It was an aircraft born of necessity, destined for a role that would soon bring it into direct and surprising conflict with the confident Japanese air forces. This modified Liberator would soon become known by its own unique designation. The Japanese pilots, steeped in the tradition of their lightweight, nimble fighters, initially viewed the new patrol bomber with a certain measure of contempt. They saw an easy, cumbersome target, a slow-moving prize ripe for the picking over the vast emptiness of the ocean. Little did they know that the design changes made for the U.S. Navy had created a very different and very dangerous adversary.
The PB4Y-2 Privateer was the embodiment of the Navy's experience and evolving needs in the brutal maritime conflict. Designated as an entirely new model, the Privateer represented a final, decisive break from its B-24 lineage. Its most notable and crucial difference was the single, immense vertical stabilizer, a massive tail replacing the twin rudders of the Liberator. This large single tail was installed to improve directional stability at low altitudes, a vital characteristic for long-duration, tedious patrol missions. The added height also allowed for a substantial increase in the field of fire for the rear turret, a critical defensive enhancement. The fuselage was significantly lengthened by almost 7 feet in front of the wing. This elongation helped to smooth out the aircraft's aerodynamic profile and provided more space for the specialized patrol equipment. The increased space was quickly filled with advanced radar, navigation gear, and more ammunition storage. The bomb bay doors were modified to carry not only depth charges and bombs but also specialized photographic and flare equipment for reconnaissance. One of the most significant improvements was the complete overhaul of the defensive armament. The privateer was transformed into a veritable fortress, bristling with 10.50 caliber machine guns, making it one of the most heavily armed patrol aircraft of the war. These guns were mounted in 6 power-operated turrets, 2 in the nose, 2 in a dorsal turret, 2 in a ventral turret, and 2 in a new twin-gun tail turret. Adding to this immense firepower were 2 additional single guns mounted in waist positions, providing truly comprehensive defensive coverage from any attack angle. This defensive matrix was a clear acknowledgement that the privateer would often operate alone, deep over enemy-held waters, where no fighter escort was possible. Its mission profile was intrinsically dangerous, a solo venture into hostile territory where every Japanese fighter was a direct threat. Consolidated Aircraft delivered the first operational PB4Y-2 to the Navy in March of 1944. Production of the new aircraft was swiftly ramped up to meet the enormous demand of the Pacific Campaign. The aircrews instantly appreciated the enhanced stability and the incredible defensive armament package. They understood immediately that their aircraft was designed not just to survive, but to fight back ferociously when cornered. The privateer was truly a flying gun platform, dedicated to hunting Japanese shipping and providing extensive reconnaissance. It was a slow, sturdy, and unapologetically heavy aircraft, built for punishment and relentless, long-duration flight. The endurance of the privateer, often exceeding 16 hours in the air, allowed it to patrol vast swathes of the Pacific. This capability closed gaps in the Allied intelligence and interdiction network that the shorter-legged aircraft could not reach. The new aircraft was ready for its baptism by fire, and the Japanese pilots were about to learn a very painful lesson about the new ugly cousin of the B-24. From the perspective of the Imperial Japanese Navy's highly trained fighter pilots, the American patrol bombers were initially a source of derision. Their primary fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was a symbol of agility, speed, and lethal grace in the air. Japanese pilots were confident in their ability to outmaneuver any multi-engine, heavy American aircraft. When the PB4Y-2 Privateer first appeared, it was seen as nothing more than a slightly different, equally clumsy iteration of the familiar B-24. The large, bulky shape of the privateer, lumbering at relatively low speeds over the ocean, made it appear as a simple target. The typical Japanese attack doctrine favored speed and surprise, utilizing hit-and-run tactics against slower bombers. They felt that any bomber, regardless of its defensive array, could be dispatched with a few well-aimed bursts of cannon fire. Intelligence reports on the new PB4Y-2 were likely sparse or misinterpreted in the early stages of its deployment. Japanese pilots probably saw the single, high tail and simply dismissed it as a minor, cosmetic change to an already known quantity. Their training instilled an inherent sense of superiority when engaging heavy, four-engine American planes. The term Kawanishi killer was not yet a recognized designation. The privateer was just another flying boxcar to them. The great myth of the Zero's invincibility still held considerable psychological sway over both sides of the conflict. This overconfidence was a critical, fatal flaw in their tactical assessment of the new patrol bomber. They likely underestimated the sheer quantity of defensive machine guns the privateer carried into battle. 10 heavy .50 caliber machine guns were a terrifying amount of metal to throw into the path of an attacking fighter. The concentration of fire from the privateer's multiple turrets was more than capable of saturating an attack vector. The aircraft was designed to survive and defend itself against multiple, simultaneous attacks from swift, single-engine fighters. Japanese pilots approaching from the rear found themselves flying directly into the new twin-gun tail turret's improved field of fire. Approaching from the front or the sides offered little relief from the dense, crisscrossing lines of fire. The privateer was designed to endure damage, a concept somewhat alien to the lightly armored Zero, which relied on speed for survival. This difference in design philosophy would be painfully exposed during the inevitable air engagements over the vast, empty ocean. The privateer was heavy, but it was also incredibly tough, capable of absorbing damage that would instantly destroy a Zero. The initial laughter and dismissive comments from the Japanese pilots soon gave way to a cold, hard realization of their error. The initial deployment of the PB4Y-2 was not without its significant and often painful lessons for American crews. Even with its improved design, the privateer remained a large, slow, and comparatively cumbersome aircraft. It was an easy visual target against the bright blue backdrop of the Pacific sky, easily spotted by sharp-eyed Japanese fighter pilots. The long-duration patrol missions often took the privateer far beyond the range of friendly fighter escorts. This placed the burden of survival entirely upon the skill of the crew and the defensive capabilities of the aircraft itself. Early encounters with Japanese fighters, particularly the deadly Zero and the later, faster models, proved harrowing for the privateer crews. Japanese pilots, utilizing their speed, would often attempt to make swift, coordinated passes to find any weakness in the defensive pattern. They quickly learned that a head-on attack was suicidal due to the heavy-nose turret armament. Therefore, they often tried to exploit the aircraft's size and relative lack of speed in a turning fight. The sheer loneliness of the patrol missions exacerbated the danger, as a damaged privateer had nowhere to land and no immediate aid. Any mechanical failure or significant combat damage over the ocean was almost certainly a death sentence for the entire crew. The crews had to navigate unpredictable weather, sudden squalls, and the ever-present threat of anti-aircraft fire over enemy-held islands. It was a monotonous, stressful, and incredibly dangerous job that required peak concentration for hours on end. Despite its defensive upgrades, the privateer's heavy armament could be rendered ineffective by surprise or overwhelming numbers. Some planes were tragically lost to coordinated attacks that managed to suppress the various gun positions simultaneously. The learning curve was steep for the new privateer crews as they adapted their tactics to maximize their survival chances. They began flying highly unpredictable patterns, constantly changing altitude and direction to confuse the attacking fighters. Crews learned to utilize the clouds and the sun for cover, a difficult maneuver for such a large airplane. The gunners, in particular, became highly proficient at coordinating their fire to create a devastating wall of .50 caliber slugs. They understood that their concentrated firepower was the privateer's only true countermeasure against the swift enemy. Every man on the crew became a vital component of the aircraft's defense, from the pilot maneuvering the plane to the navigator spotting approaching aircraft. The early losses were a testament to the lethality of the enemy fighters, but they also forged a new, hardened breed of patrol bomber crew. These men transformed the privateer from a clumsy target into a deeply respected, heavily armed opponent. The transformation was essential for the privateer to successfully execute its primary mission of maritime interdiction. The 10.50 caliber machine guns were the heart and soul of the PB4Y-2 Privateer's formidable reputation. This impressive armament was a deliberate design choice, reflecting the Navy's experience in the grueling air battles over the Pacific. The standard .50 caliber round was a potent projectile, capable of inflicting severe structural damage on a fighter aircraft. The gun turrets were strategically placed to ensure there were no blind spots, providing a full 360-degree sphere of defensive fire. The nose section alone featured a pair of turrets, often controlled by the bombardier, which could pour a massive amount of fire directly forward. This head-on firepower was a devastating deterrent, effectively discouraging the preferred high-speed passes of the Japanese fighters. The twin dorsal turret, mounted on the spine of the aircraft, provided excellent coverage above and to the sides. The ventral turret, positioned underneath the belly, protected the critical, often overlooked approach from below. However, the most significant improvement was arguably the twin-gun tail turret, featuring an excellent field of fire thanks to the new single tail. This meant an attacking Zero pilot could no longer safely linger behind the bomber to line up a perfect shot. Each gunner in the privateer was a specialist, trained not only to shoot accurately but also to coordinate their fire with the other positions. The crews developed a tactic called mutual support, where multiple turrets would focus their fire on a single attacking aircraft. This created a literal curtain of lead, making any successful attack a matter of extreme risk for the Japanese pilot. The sheer volume of fire was designed to overwhelm a single attacker and force them to break off their pass prematurely. The privateer also carried a substantial payload in its bomb bay, though its main purpose was not high-altitude bombing. This internal bay held a deadly mix of depth charges, bombs, and even rockets, intended for anti-shipping and anti-submarine work. The ability to carry depth charges made the privateer an effective weapon against unseen Japanese submarines that threatened Allied supply lines. The bombs were crucial for attacking the small, isolated Japanese supply ships, known as Maru ships, that desperately tried to reach their garrisons. The privateer's design successfully blended reconnaissance, defense, and offensive striking power into one powerful airframe. It was an aircraft that did not rely on speed to survive, it relied on its ability to shoot down anything that dared to approach it. The crews quickly learned to maximize their firepower, transforming the slow patrol bomber into an airborne gunship of the highest caliber. The PB4Y-2 truly came into its own as an indispensable component of the Black Cats, the legendary night-flying squadron of the U.S. Navy. The Black Cats initially flew the older Catalina PBY seaplanes, but the privateer provided a massive leap in capability and lethality. Night operations over the Pacific were an intensely difficult and dangerous affair for all involved. However, the darkness provided a cloak of invisibility that shielded the heavy bombers from most enemy fighter opposition. The Japanese relied heavily on nighttime movements for their vital resupply missions to remote, cut-off island garrisons. Small, unescorted convoys of cargo ships would try to slip past the American forces under the cover of the moonless sky. These fragile supply lines became the primary targets for the newly deployed privateers. The privateer was perfectly suited for this nocturnal hunting role due to its exceptional range and its advanced radar systems. The standard radar set, typically an ASV, air-to-surface vessel, radar, was capable of detecting the relatively small, low-riding ships. The radar operator, working in the dark confines of the fuselage, became the most important man on these night patrols. His eyes were fixed on the glowing green scope, searching for the telltale blips of enemy shipping beneath the waves of night. Once a target was acquired, the pilot would begin a slow, calculated descent to investigate the contact. The element of surprise was everything in these operations, as a quick attack minimized the chances of an alert being raised. The privateer would often approach the target low and fast, dropping down to mast height to avoid detection by shipborne radar. When the moment was right, the crew would unleash a volley of bombs or depth charges, aiming to sink the ship outright or leave it burning and disabled. The sheer terror of a nighttime attack from an unseen aircraft was devastating to the Japanese crews. They had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide on the vast, empty ocean surface. The Black Cat's success with the privateer was astronomical, significantly disrupting the flow of Japanese supplies and reinforcements. The sheer number of small cargo ships and oilers sunk began to create a severe logistical crisis for the entire Japanese war effort. The Japanese command began to realize that the sea at night was no longer a safe haven for their vital shipping. The privateer crews, flying in the dead of night, became true ghosts of the Pacific, their attacks both sudden and impossible to prevent. The core mission of the PB4Y-2 was the merciless destruction of Japanese maritime commerce. This anti-shipping role, known as ditching the Marus, became a strategic priority in the final years of the war. Japan, an island nation, was entirely dependent on its network of cargo and oiler ships for its survival. The sinking of these merchant vessels choked off the supply of vital resources like fuel, food, and ammunition to frontline units. The privateers, with their incredible range, were able to patrol the long, dangerous sea lanes that the Japanese relied upon. They operated from bases like Tinian and Peleliu, launching deep into the enemy's logistical backyard. The tactics employed were often daring and extremely risky, requiring precision flying at dangerously low altitudes. A typical attack involved approaching the ship from the stern, utilizing the element of surprise against the slow-moving target. The pilot would fly the aircraft directly toward the water, releasing their ordnance at mast height to ensure maximum effect. A direct hit from a bomb or depth charge on a small cargo vessel was usually enough to send it to the bottom of the sea. The Japanese ships were often lightly armed, relying more on camouflage and secrecy than heavy defensive firepower. However, even a single-mast gun could pose a serious threat to a bomber flying directly into its line of fire. The privateer's crews had to contend with the immediate danger of water splashes from near misses, which could fatally damage the aircraft's wings. If the first pass did not achieve the desired result, the crew would circle and make another, relentless in their pursuit of the kill. The privateers were responsible for sinking countless thousands of tons of irreplaceable Japanese shipping. This relentless attrition on the high seas systematically crippled the Imperial Navy's ability to wage sustained warfare. The attacks were not just military blows, they were strategic victories that directly contributed to the strangulation of the Japanese economy. The crews understood the vital importance of their work, knowing that every sunk vessel brought the war closer to an end. The sight of the large, unmistakable single tail of the privateer became a terrifying omen for any Japanese mariner. The air-sea war of attrition in the Pacific was fundamentally won by aircraft like the PB4Y-2 that could dominate the sea lanes. The war in the Pacific was ultimately a logistical contest, and the privateer became a key player in strangling the Japanese supply chain. The term Maru was the suffix for most Japanese merchant ships, and sinking them became a grim but necessary duty for the privateer crews. These ships were the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine, carrying everything from troops to fuel to rice. The patrols were often long and uneventful, spanning hundreds of miles of empty ocean, a tedious search for a small moving target. Suddenly, the monotonous drone of the engines would be broken by the cry of a radar operator, "Contact!" The crew would immediately transition from bored vigilance to intense, focused combat readiness. The privateer's great range allowed it to discover and destroy Japanese ships in areas that were previously considered safe havens. They patrolled the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the coastal waters around the Japanese home islands themselves. The crews learned to identify the typical shipping lanes and the times when the Japanese were most likely to attempt a convoy run. They also learned to be patient, often tailing a convoy for hours, waiting for the perfect time to strike with minimal risk. In addition to sinking ships, the privateers were responsible for critical photographic reconnaissance of enemy ports and beaches. Their pictures provided essential, up-to-the-minute intelligence for the planning of future amphibious invasions. The high-resolution cameras could spot troop movements, newly built fortifications, and the movement of naval assets. This information was often just as valuable as the sinking of a ship, guiding the overall strategy of the Allied campaign. The privateer's combination of heavy armament and long range made it a true multi-role platform, indispensable to the Navy's operations. It was more than just a bomber, it was a hunter, a spy, and a heavily armed sentinel of the ocean skies. The relentless pressure applied by the privateers on the enemy's supply network was a major factor in the collapse of Japanese resistance. The success of the PB4Y-2 in its nighttime and anti-shipping roles was inextricably linked to its sophisticated radar equipment. The privateer carried some of the most advanced air-to-surface vessel (ASV) radar sets available during World War II. This technology transformed the vast, empty ocean, which was once a hiding place, into a transparent environment for the privateer's crew. The radar operator sat hunched in a dark compartment, his world reduced to the glowing green phosphorescence of the scope. He was the eyes of the aircraft, capable of spotting a ship-sized target many miles away, regardless of the weather or the darkness. This capability was revolutionary, allowing the privateer to operate around the clock with lethal precision. Japanese pilots were often at a loss when trying to intercept a privateer at night, as they lacked comparable airborne radar technology. Their inability to see the enemy in the dark meant the privateer was almost immune to fighter opposition during its most effective hunting hours. The radar also allowed the crews to navigate through heavy cloud cover and fog, which were common over the Pacific. This ability to fly in all weather conditions meant that the patrols were almost continuous, never giving the enemy a break. The operator would constantly monitor the screen, looking for the tiny, distinct blip that indicated the presence of a ship or a submarine snorkel. As the aircraft closed the distance, the blip would grow larger, allowing the operator to guide the pilot directly to the target. This radar-guided approach ensured maximum surprise and reduced the chances of the target taking evasive maneuvers. The tension in the cockpit during a radar-guided interception must have been palpable, a silent hunt played out entirely on the scope. Once the target was visually acquired, the radar would then be used to track the ship's movement and speed. This ensured the pilot could calculate the perfect drop point for the depth charges or bombs with extraordinary accuracy. The privateer's radar was not only an offensive tool, it was also a defensive asset, helping to spot landmasses and enemy aircraft. It was a true force multiplier, turning the slow, unglamorous patrol bomber into a weapon of high-tech precision warfare. The initial scorn of the Japanese fighter pilots was rapidly replaced by a grudging, and then profound, respect for the PB4Y-2. This shift in attitude was driven by the undeniable and painful evidence of their own increasing losses. It was one thing to see a slow bomber, it was another to try and survive an attack run on a heavily armed flying fortress. Japanese pilots began reporting back to base about the overwhelming defensive firepower of the single-tailed naval bomber. They quickly realized that the old tactics of sweeping, close-range passes were no longer viable against the privateer. Attacks often resulted in heavy damage to the Zero or other fighter models, forcing the Japanese pilots to break off their engagement. The sheer durability of the privateer was another source of astonishment and frustration for the attacking forces. Stories began to circulate of privateers returning to base with massive chunks of their wings and fuselages missing. The rugged construction and lack of fuel tanks in the wings, unlike the B-24, allowed it to absorb incredible punishment. The Japanese pilots had to contend with the reality that destroying a privateer required a sustained, coordinated effort. This level of effort was difficult to achieve over the vast, isolated expanses of the Pacific where they rarely flew in large formations. The privateer was no longer laughed at, it was feared, earning the sobering nickname Kawanishi Killer for its anti-seaplane work. The Japanese command began to issue new, urgent directives to their pilots on how to best engage the PB4Y-2. These new tactics acknowledged the aircraft's 10 guns and its robust airframe as a formidable threat. The psychological impact of fighting an aircraft that simply refused to be shot down was enormous on the Japanese aircrews. It chipped away at the ingrained belief in the superiority of their own fighter designs and pilot training. The privateer had successfully reversed the dynamic, it was no longer the prey, but a dangerous predator. Any engagement with a PB4Y-2 became a serious tactical consideration, a risk versus reward calculation. The Japanese learned the hard way that beneath the privateer's somewhat clumsy exterior lay a core of brutal, unrelenting toughness. The privateer had unequivocally earned its place as one of the most respected and dangerous adversaries of the Pacific skies. When the war finally ended in 1945, the story of the PB4Y-2 Privateer was far from over. The aircraft's robustness, long range, and generous size made it an ideal candidate for continued service and civilian roles. It remained in United States Navy and Coast Guard service for many years following the cessation of hostilities. The Navy primarily used the privateers for meteorological observation, carrying specialized equipment for weather analysis. The Coast Guard utilized the aircraft for critical search and rescue missions over the vast stretches of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Its long endurance meant it could loiter over a search area for hours, a crucial asset in saving lives at sea. Many privateers were eventually transferred to friendly foreign air forces as part of American military aid programs. The French Aeronautic Navale used the privateers extensively during the Indochina and Algerian wars. They employed the aircraft for reconnaissance, bombing, and close air support, proving its versatility beyond its original design. However, one of the most surprising and enduring second acts for the privateer was its transformation into a civil firefighter. Many surplus airframes were purchased by civilian companies and converted into air tankers. The large bomb bay, which once held depth charges, was modified to carry thousands of gallons of fire retardant. These converted privateers became a familiar sight across the American West, fighting massive forest fires for decades. The aircraft's rugged construction and powerful engines made it a reliable workhorse in the challenging and dangerous environment of aerial firefighting. The privateer's ability to fly low and slow, a characteristic that once drew scorn, now made it perfect for accurate fire retardant drops. Its presence in the civilian sector ensured that the aircraft remained an active part of the skies long after its military retirement. Though the final air tankers were retired in the 1980s, the privateer had demonstrated an incredible service life. From a bomber derivative to a night hunter, to a search plane, and finally to a firefighter, its legacy is one of remarkable adaptability. The PB4Y-2 Privateer stands as a testament to the fact that appearance is often misleading in the crucible of war. It was an aircraft initially ridiculed for its perceived clumsiness and lack of aesthetic grace compared to dedicated fighters. Yet, it evolved into a highly effective, specialized weapon that played a critical, strategic role in the Pacific victory. The seemingly minor design change of the single tail was in fact a massive step forward in operational stability and defensive capability. It was the perfect blend of the familiar B-24 endurance and the necessary naval requirements for overwater dominance. The privateer's success was not measured in dogfight victories, but in the sinking of countless enemy supply ships. It was measured in the intelligence gathered over enemy shores and the complete disruption of Japanese logistical efforts. It was the plane that took the fight directly to the enemy's economic and strategic choke points, flying where no fighter could follow. The PB4Y-2 proved that sheer firepower and unyielding durability could easily overcome the agility of a lightweight fighter. The men who flew the privateer were unsung heroes of the air, engaged in a dangerous, lonely, and monotonous war of attrition. They faced down the best of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air forces and taught them a lesson in respect through concentrated .50 caliber fire. The story of the privateer is a classic military narrative of an underdog that found its true purpose in the heat of battle. It is a reminder that innovation often comes from necessity and that specialized tools outperform general ones in specific tasks. The aircraft transitioned from the ugly cousin to a fearsome black cat of the night, a silent, deadly executioner of enemy shipping. Its legacy endures today, not just in military history books, but in the physical remnants of the airframes that once flew for the Forest Service. The privateer went on to save lives as a Coast Guard sentinel and later as a tireless, airborne firefighter. This heavy, powerful, and heavily armed patrol bomber ultimately proved to be an aircraft that the Japanese learned to fear. The fear replaced the laughter, and that transformation is the true measure of the privateer's incredible wartime success.